As the pale, freezing light of dawn finally broke over the deeply traumatized town of Cowra on the morning of August 5, the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of the violent nocturnal eruption was horrifically revealed. The shattered, blood-soaked perimeter fences were heavily draped with thousands of torn woolen blankets and the lifeless, deeply lacerated bodies of dozens of Japanese soldiers who had brutally perished on the heavy razor wire. Inside the heavily damaged compound, the chaotic, bloody aftermath resembled a horrific, active war zone. However, the most immediate, highly terrifying crisis lay completely beyond the shattered fences. Over 300 deeply desperate, heavily radicalized enemy combatants were now roaming entirely free within the remote, sparsely populated agricultural heartland of New South Wales. The Australian military, deeply shocked and deeply fearful of a violent, widespread rampage against isolated civilian farms, immediately initiated one of the most massive, highly intensive, and deeply frantic manhunts in the entire history of the continent. Heavily armed military patrols, thousands of local police officers, and heavily armed civilian volunteer militias aggressively scoured the rugged, freezing landscape, heavily supported by specialized Aboriginal trackers and military aircraft desperately scanning the vast, rolling plains from the sky. However, the deeply terrified Australian civilians rapidly discovered that the escaped Japanese soldiers had absolutely no strategic intention of violently attacking the local population or conducting a coordinated military insurgency. The escapees were completely, deeply disoriented by the vast, harsh, and entirely unfamiliar Australian landscape. They were dressed only in thin, highly inadequate maroon-colored prisoner uniforms, entirely exposed to the brutal, sub-zero temperatures of the freezing outback winter. Stripped of the frenzied, chaotic adrenaline of the initial nighttime charge, the grim, absolute reality of their hopeless situation violently crashed down upon them. They possessed no food, no compasses, and absolutely no viable means of ever returning to their deeply revered homeland. Driven by the strict, uncompromising dictates of their military honor code, the vast majority of the escapees firmly chose to end their own lives rather than suffer the profound, deeply unbearable indignity of being captured for a second time. The Australian search parties frequently encountered scenes of profound, deeply unsettling tragedy in the quiet bush. Small, isolated groups of Japanese soldiers who had respectfully, ceremoniously hanged themselves from the thick branches of ancient eucalyptus trees, or men who had brutally, desperately used their crude, sharpened kitchen knives to commit ritualistic suicide in the freezing dirt. The massive, heavily armed manhunt completely concluded within 9 freezing, deeply agonizing days. The deeply exhausted, starving, and heavily frostbitten survivors were systematically rounded up and peacefully returned to the heavily reinforced prison compound. The final, official death toll of the violent Cowra breakout was absolutely staggering and deeply tragic. 231 Japanese soldiers violently perished during the chaotic charge or subsequently committed suicide in the freezing outback, while another 108 were severely wounded. 4 deeply courageous Australian soldiers, including the heroic machine gunners Benjamin Hardy and Ralph Jones, who were both posthumously awarded the prestigious George Cross for their supreme valor, were brutally killed during the violent melee. The terrifying, completely unprecedented events of the Cowra breakout fundamentally shocked the Australian nation, providing a grim, deeply terrifying first-hand insight into the absolute, uncompromising psychological fanaticism of the Imperial Japanese military. Yet, in the decades following the horrific bloodshed, a profound, deeply moving spirit of reconciliation miraculously blossomed. The town of Cowra meticulously, deeply respectfully maintained the immaculate Japanese war cemetery, where the fallen prisoners were buried with full military honors, ultimately transforming a site of absolute violence into a profoundly powerful, enduring international symbol of peace and historical healing. The catastrophic silence of the complacent Darwin morning was violently, horrifically shattered at exactly 9:58 a.m. It was not a minor, scattered formation, but rather a massive, highly coordinated, and devastating strike force of 188 Imperial Japanese aircraft, including specialized, high-altitude level bombers, rapid-fire, low-level A-6M0 fighters, and highly agile Val dive bombers, that aggressively swooped down upon the completely defenseless city from the blinding tropical sun. It was an apocalyptic spectacle of industrialized destruction and raw, terrifying chaos. The massive formations of Japanese dive bombers ruthlessly singled out the dense concentration of vital military and merchant shipping tightly packed within the narrow confines of Darwin Harbor. The very first, massive explosions targeted the strategic oil tanks on the cliffs, sending gigantic, rolling plumes of thick, oily black smoke high into the previously clear blue sky, instantly plunging the entire waterfront into a grim, terrifying darkness. The harbor rapidly, violently transformed into a raging, fiery inferno of screaming men and burning oil. The American destroyer USS Perry, attempting to desperately build steam to escape the confined waters, was brutally struck by multiple heavy Japanese bombs, violently exploding and sinking in a massive fireball, taking nearly 100 brave sailors down with her. The massive merchant ship MV Neptuna, fully loaded with ammunition and depth charges, was struck directly, triggering a catastrophic, unparalleled detonation that violently ripped the massive vessel apart, instantly vaporizing every soul on board and raining hundreds of tons of twisted steel and heavy debris down upon the surrounding ships and the devastated docks. Simultaneously, while the heavy bombers ruthlessly targeted the ships, hundreds of highly skilled, low-level Zero fighters began a systematic, terrifying campaign of mass destruction. They relentlessly strafed the completely crowded, chaotic wooden docks, where dozens of civilian waterside workers were desperately, vainly attempting to unload vital military cargo, cutting them down in a hail of high-caliber bullets. The massive formations then turned their aggressive, overwhelming attention directly onto the helpless RAF airfields located in the center of the city. The few Australian and American fighter planes attempting to scramble were completely helplessly overwhelmed before they could even attempt to gain significant altitude, ruthlessly mown down in the sky or systematically destroyed on the ground by the blindingly fast Japanese Zeros. The terrifying air raid was not limited to strictly military objectives. The massive formations of Japanese-level bombers simultaneously targeted the heart of the civilian city itself. Multiple heavy high-explosive bombs violently struck the beautifully constructed local post office, instantly killing the postmaster, his family, and several young telecommunications workers who were bravely trying to maintain vital communications under fire. The local hospital was hit multiple times, violently destroying an entire wing and horrifically killing several nurses and patients. The city's entire power, water, and telephone infrastructure was totally annihilated within a matter of mere minutes, leaving the entire traumatized city entirely plunged into a horrific, smoke-filled chaos of absolute panic and total, absolute helplessness. The initial, chaotic, and relentlessly brutal Japanese assault lasted for a profoundly terrifying 40 minutes, during which the city was mercilessly pounded with a devastating volume of high-explosive bombs that exceeded the total tonnage dropped during the entire Pearl Harbor raid. When the first wave finally departed to the north, leaving the harbor as a massive, smoke-filled graveyard and the airfields as twisted ruins, a brief, highly misleading period of absolute silence descended upon the traumatized city. Exhausted, traumatized survivors, many covered in thick, dark oil and bleeding profusely, cautiously emerged from their inadequate shelters, only to find the massive, overwhelming formations of the second Japanese wave, an additional 54 heavy, twin-engine Mitsubishi G3M Nell and G4M Betty bombers from land bases in the Celebes, already aggressively roaring overhead at a high altitude from a different direction. They ruthlessly initiated a second, highly systematic, and relentlessly accurate bombing campaign that lasted for an agonizing 25 minutes. They targeted the remaining, undamaged military barracks at Larakia and the surviving RAF base, entirely flattening any remaining, essential military operational capacity and deliberately causing a secondary, widespread wave of massive, deep civilian panic and total, absolute social collapse across the entire, deeply scarred city, ensuring that Darwin was fundamentally, permanently knocked out of the war as an active military asset for months to come. As the final massive Japanese heavy bombers permanently disappeared over the dark, smoky horizon shortly after noon on February 19, 1942, the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of the violent tropical destruction was horrifically revealed. The previous idyllic tropical tranquility of Darwin was entirely erased, completely replaced by an absolute, terrifying apocalyptic nightmare. Darwin Harbor was a massive, smoke-shrouded graveyard of sinking, burning, and violently exploded ships, its turquoise waters completely blackened by thousands of tons of heavy, dark crude oil, with hundreds of mutilated, lifeless bodies of both Allied sailors and innocent civilian workers tragically floating among the wreckage. The once bustling town itself was a deeply scarred, skeletal ruin of twisted, blackened iron, collapsed wooden timbers, and the harrowing, agonizing screams of thousands of severely wounded civilians and soldiers. Multiple large, roaring fires, fueled by the hundreds of tons of spilled fuel and ammunition, raged uncontrollably through the flattened business district and the residential neighborhoods, with absolutely no functional water supply to attempt to fight the inferno. The initial, devastating human toll of the attack was horrific and unprecedented. Roughly 250 men, women, and children, including Allied military personnel and Darwin's diverse civilian population, were brutally killed, while hundreds more were severely, horrifically wounded. However, the true, deeply embarrassing political disaster for the Australian government was just beginning. In the hours and days immediately following the horrific, unprovoked massacre, the fragile social fabric of Darwin completely, utterly, and catastrophically collapsed into a chaotic, terrifying state of primitive mass panic. Believing with absolute, terrifying certainty that the massive, devastating aerial bombardment was merely a gentler prelude to an immediate, full-scale Japanese amphibious invasion force landing on the beaches, thousands of deeply traumatized military personnel and hundreds of local civilians completely, utterly abandoned their standard military posts, standard police duties, and standard medical responsibilities. They violently fled entirely into the dense, harsh Australian bushland in a chaotic, wild, and highly disorganized exodus that became grimly, historically immortalized as the Adelaide River Stakes. Absolute, massive, and entirely uncontrolled looting of the abandoned businesses, banks, and private homes in the central city became ubiquitous, rampant, and deeply widespread, with Australian soldiers and provists frequently seen leading the lawless rampage. The civil and military administration of the entire northern region completely, totally, and absolutely failed, with key government officials and senior IF commanders among the very first to join the massive, panicked stampede to the south, entirely abandoning the devastated city and its deeply traumatized remaining population to face absolute social breakdown on their own. In the crucial days and weeks that followed the horrific, humiliating military biological disaster, the wartime Australian government in Canberra, deeply terrified that a widespread, honest dissemination of the absolute, humiliating military failures and the subsequent, widespread social panic in Darwin would completely, utterly break the fragile morale of the entire nation, instituted a massive, and entirely pervasive campaign of strict censorship and information suppression. They deliberately, systematically issued heavily falsified, significantly downplayed official reports to the terrified public, explicitly claiming that only a few minor buildings had been damaged and that a mere 17 military personnel had been killed. Any detailed, highly descriptive newspaper accounts from the small number of brave war correspondents on the scene were strictly, brutally heavily censored. Furthermore, any personal, detailed letters sent from the deeply traumatized Darwin survivors to their families in the South were aggressively intercepted, and heavily mutilated or completely destroyed by the military censorship officers. This profound, systematic suppression was so effective that the single largest attack by a foreign power on Australian soil remained shrouded in secrecy and deliberate national amnesia for decades. It wasn't until many years after the war that the true, terrifying scale of the devastation, the heroism of the defenders, and the shameful collapse of authority were fully acknowledged, finally cementing the bombing of Darwin as Australia's own tragic, bloody, and defining Pearl Harbor.